I'm Bob Rubin, and by behalf of my colleagues at the Hamilton Project, welcome to today's discussion about infrastructure. We've had a number of events over the years, the Hamilton Project has, on infrastructure, and a lot of that work remains germane and relevant today. Having said that, there is obviously going to be a tremendous amount of debate, tremendous amount of discussion, tremendous amount of focus on infrastructure in the time to come. And so, continuing in the vein that we've been in the past, we will have our discussion today, and we are very fortunate in that respect in having a remarkable panel to focus on the complex issues that infrastructure poses. In order to preserve time for our panel and also for our distinguished keynote speaker, I am only going to make one comment on infrastructure. And that comment is that nothing is as simple as it seems. Our country has an imperative need, as we all know, for addressing deferred maintenance and for new infrastructure. But there are immensely complicated issues around all of this, including how to minimize the effect of politics, the role of politics in project selection, how to increase the application of cost-benefit analysis to project selection, to project design, and very importantly, to regulatory approvals, the potential for private sector involvement, the use of revenues and other user fees, taking into account the potential regressive impacts of those mechanisms, and very importantly, and probably of greatest difficulty, substantively and politically, is the question of how to fund infrastructure. On that last point, the funding of infrastructure, relatively low interest rates that we've now had for quite some time are obviously conducive to deficit funding. But in my view, interest rates are only one of many variables, and it's a complex set of variables that need to be taken into account with respect to deficit funding to determine whether that deficit funding is favorable or unfavorable for our economy, and favorable or unfavorable with respect to the longer-term trajectory of debt to GDP. And I assume that those variables will be part of the discussion that our panel has today. Beyond the discussion, you will find in your materials a thoughtful and insightful paper. It was issued today by the Hamilton Project with respect to infrastructure, entitled "If You Build It, A Guide to the Economics of Infrastructure Investment." It was designed to be a primer and also to provide serious substantive consideration to the very complex issues that I briefly alluded to before. Diane Schatzenbach, the director of the Hamilton Project, will briefly present that paper later in the program. It is now my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for our event, the Honorable Steny Hoyer, Minority Whip in the House of Representatives, and I am happy to say, a longtime friend. Steny, as you know, has a reputation for being an outstanding legislator and for having been continuously focused on trying to make our political system work in what has generally been a relatively difficult political environment, and for his commitment to building consensus in that environment. He's been a longtime supporter of infrastructure projects. Among his other accomplishments, he guided the American with Disabilities Act to overwhelming passage in the House of Representatives in 1990 and led in the enactment of the Help Americans Vote Act. I do a certain amount of public speaking, and when I discuss political dysfunction, I often cite Steny as a model, at least in my view, for what members of Congress should be and how they should function in their roles if our political system is going to be effective in meeting the hugely consequential policy challenges that it faces. So with that, it is my enormous privilege and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Representative Steny Hoyer. Steny?
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm a huge fan of Bob Rubin's. That introduction is not the only reason, but it is certainly a useful reason. Bob, thank you very much for your service to our country. Thank you very much for the advice and counsel you have given to us, not only on our side of the aisle, but on the other side of the aisle on a regular basis, on so many different issues so important to our country. Appreciate it very much, and your leadership of the Hamilton Project. I want to congratulate all of those who are associated with the Hamilton Project, which I think has issued a number of papers and has given ongoing, continued, responsible advice. If followed, the country would be in much better shape. And the country is in pretty good shape now, notwithstanding the inaugural address. I will try not to be too partisan, you understand. Try. Diane, thank you very much for your leadership as well, and my good buddy Karen Anderson, who is here, who's been so much involved over the time. Bob Rubin says that this microphone is going to be turned off in 15 minutes, so to say whatever you want to say, Hoyer, but 15 minutes, you're gone. I want to thank also Peter Orzag, Alan Blinder, and so many others for their extraordinary service and advice and counsel through the years. And I want to say to all of them, we appreciate your work. Good roads, canals, and navigable rivers. Alexander Hamilton wrote, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put the remote parts of a country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighborhood of the town. They are, upon that account, the greatest of all improvements. Much has changed, of course, since Hamilton's report on manufacturers in 1791, but the premise of his statement remains true. Infrastructure is one of the best investments a nation can make. To facilitate economic growth by, quote, diminishing the expenses of carriage, as Hamilton put it, but also to stitch the people of our large and diverse country closer together and closer to markets abroad, making access to opportunity more equally available. I mentioned a number of people. I want to mention also Jason Furman, who's worked closely with me, and the wonderful Alice Rivlin, who has done so much for our country through the years. To facilitate economic growth by, quote, diminishing the expense of carriage, but also to stitch the people together. To invest in infrastructure and reap its benefits requires consensus. I was at a dinner last night. We had a number of people, and I mentioned as minority whip for the first time. It's not a job that I've sought, minority whip. Majority leader was a much better post, actually. But I mentioned the psychology of consensus as opposed to the word compromise. Creating consensus has not been what we've been doing lately, and that's unfortunate, and we are reaping the conflict that has created. Consensus demands a Congress and administration committed to long-term planning, which often requires making difficult fiscal choices. I tell my colleagues, you cannot solve America's problems in 24-month cycles. The question isn't whether we should invest, but how we can do so most efficiently and productively so as to save taxpayer dollars over the long term within fiscally responsible context. Any discussion about our ability to do so must acknowledge the proverbial elephant in the room. That, of course, is the unprecedented administration of Donald Trump and the uncertainty it has unleashed across our country and our economy. We simply cannot talk about infrastructure investment or any policy issue in the same way we did a year ago. Certainly not the same way we were forced to 8 years ago. When the previous administration came into office, we were talking a lot about infrastructure, but for different reasons. In the opening days of the Obama presidency, the national conversation about infrastructure concerned how to support aggregate demand in the context of economic stimulus to stem the bleeding and lay the foundation for a stronger jobs recovery. Frankly, I believe we missed an opportunity to do more than we did. And our focus should have been on further investment and greater investment in infrastructure. In my view, including only $69 billion out of $787 billion in the Recovery Act in 2009 for infrastructure was a missed opportunity. Instead, we included tax cuts in the hopes of getting Republicans on board and ended up with none voting for it. I continue to question whether some of those tax cuts would have been better spent as a direct infrastructure investment instead. And I had discussions with members of the administration on that very issue during the course of our consideration of the Recovery Act. Now, after 8 years of steady growth and an unprecedented recovery, with our unemployment rate at 4.8% and more than 16 million net private sector jobs created, the focus of infrastructure needs to be on building a sustainable economic model that can enhance our long-term competitiveness, which will be key to making opportunity more broadly accessible. Historically, we have relied on the gasoline tax at the pump, largely to fund highway and transportation improvements generally. Unfortunately, we did not set up the gas tax like a tax, sales tax, reflecting increased costs for funding our infrastructure needs. Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Ranking Member Peter DeFazio has been saying that the gas tax needs to be on the table in discussions about infrastructure and financing. The Speaker does not share that view. And if you have one takeaway from my remarks this morning, it is that we must pay for the investments we make. We must ensure a sustainable funding method over the long term. Most of the conversations over the past few years with regard to funding have been about leveraging repatriation. As everyone in this room well knows, the idea is that a levy of repatriated corporate earnings held overseas could find a one-time infrastructure boost fund. And we've seen proposals on both sides of the aisle along these lines. Today, however, the comprehensive tax reform proposal that House Republicans are working on, their so-called blueprint, includes such a deemed repatriation, but employs it solely as an offset for a reduction in tax rates, not for investment. Ways and Means Committee Ranking Member Richie Neal who's a longtime member of the committee, but a new ranking member, has been working on the tax reform issue and had this to say last week on the current state of play. Quote, "We are now seeing three competing proposals, one from the White House, one from Republicans in the House, and a bit of a standoffish approach in the United States Senate." He went on to say, "You're not going to do tax policy with one party and leave the other side out. Because in the end, if that happens, all that means is the side that doesn't prevail, they simply do a reset and prepare for the next round." The creation of consensus. House Democrats believe that sustainable investments in infrastructure continue to be among the most productive activities when it comes to supporting long-term economic growth. We thought that prior to the Great Recession. We thought that in early 2009, and we continue to hold that view. I would argue that many of the so-called pro-growth tax policies do not do that in the Republican blueprint. But no matter how much will exist on Capitol Hill and the White House to make infrastructure a priority, the reality is a difficult political hurdle must first be cleared. Divisions within the Republican House majority remain, as all of us have seen. And there are some divisions in our own party, in my party, unwilling to support any investment that increased spending, even those designed to achieve growth over the long term. Among those willing, the idea they ought to be financed with anything other than reductions elsewhere in the budget is a tough sell. That leaves congressional leadership and the president in a bind. One need look no further to find evidence of these divisions than President Trump's proposed border wall, which will not make us, in my opinion, safer or grow the economy or put us on any more sound fiscal footing. But it will be costly, and the issue of how one pays for it, if one unreasonably, I guess, assumes that Mexico may not pay for it, is difficult. There is no consensus among Republicans on how to pay for it. The only thing certain is that Mexico, in my opinion, will not. I've been speaking a lot about infrastructure investments and their benefits over the past decades. It says several years here, but we've been talking about this for decades. And their benefits over the past several years. And I've traveled around the country talking about House Democrats' agenda, which I have put forward, Make It in America, one facet of which is the critically important investment in infrastructure. Not only does it create jobs in the short term, but it creates economic activity in the long term. Eisenhower's investment in the highway system, along with George Fallon from Maryland, who was the chairman of the Public Works Committee at that point in time, but Eisenhower's effort has made an extraordinary difference economically in our country over the long term. From the public hearings we've held and from the discussions within our caucus, several proposals for how to improve our infrastructure networks have been introduced. So we're ready to come to the table with ideas as well as with votes, because it will take a bipartisan agreement to get a meaningful infrastructure program done. There will be some people who will not vote for an infrastructure program at all. As we move forward with discussions about the infrastructure investments, it is critical that we focus on how we do so in a fiscally sustainable way. That is a recurring theme with me, as you've heard, but it is absolutely essential, while prioritizing investments that will connect people and markets rather than build barriers between them. I know that the panelists assembled here today, an extraordinary group of people with whom I've had the pleasure and privilege of working very closely over the last 20 years. I know the panelists here today will go into more detail about the different options before us, whether it's leveraging repatriated earnings, offering tax credits, expanding user fees, or any number of other ideas or a combination thereof, including as what my Maryland colleague, Representative John Delaney, has proposed. We need to find a way to get this done. The good news is there is agreement. President Trump has talked about $1 trillion of investment in infrastructure. We have been talking about infrastructure investment, although, as I said, I think we badly underinvested in the Recovery Act in infrastructure. And we also did not think very long-term, i.e., we said shovel-ready within 18 months. Frankly, had we put another $200 billion of the $787 billion into infrastructure, we would be reaping the benefits today of that investment. The time is ripe to do it now, given the low interest rate, which was referred to by Secretary Rubin, as well as recognition among members in both parties and the president that infrastructure is an area where consensus is possible. I say that, I hope it is true. With deficient bridges, with ports and airports straining at capacity, our power grid requiring upgrades, water and sewer pipes in need of replacement, Flint being just the tip of the iceberg, and with many areas of rural America still unconnected to broadband, the need for robust infrastructure investment is clear and compelling. The tragedy that occurred in Flint, Michigan is a lesson of the importance. I look forward to hearing about the ideas that come out of today's conversation. And I thank this very distinguished group of experts for sharing their insights and contributing to this critical national discussion. This is a difficult time in our country. It is a time of deep division within our country. This is the 50th year in which I've been in public office, having been elected to the state senate in 1966. Never have I seen a time where there is any less certainty on the path forward, and where our country is any more at risk from being unable to move forward in a constructive, positive, successful way for the American people. It is a time, therefore, for all of us to come together and use our best judgment to reach consensus. America is a great country right now. When John Kennedy ran for office, he said, "It is a great country, but it can be greater. it will be greater if we reach that consensus. Thank you very much for all of you do to help us get there. Thank you very much. Pretty close.
Well, thank you very much. That was terrific. I'm Diane Schanzebach. I'm the director of the Hamilton Project, and I'm going to briefly go through the primer that we've written on infrastructure spending. So, of course, while the debate over a massive infrastructure bill is temporarily eased away from the news a bit, we expect that debate to reemerge later this spring or summer. And so with the heat turned down a little bit, we wanted to encourage some thoughtful discussion about infrastructure spending. So in just a minute, I will invite our august panel of experts up to discuss some fiscally responsible policy options for funding and financing infrastructure investments. And so in conjunction with this event, the Hamilton Project is releasing a framing paper that each of you has, which lays out an economic framework for infrastructure investment. I will very briefly outline that now. We start with the observation that infrastructure investment has been insufficient to meet the nation's maintenance and expansion needs. Annual investment has declined, so net public non-defense investment at all levels of government was 1.5% of GDP in 1980, but only 0.6% in 2015. As infrastructure deteriorates, many sectors of the economy lose their ability to operate efficiently. Over recent years, the United States has experienced a large slowdown in productivity growth over the past dozen years that it amounts to about almost $3 trillion of cumulative lost economic output. Some of this is likely due to our lack of infrastructure investment. Because much of the nation's infrastructure generates broadly shared benefits that are not limited to those who can pay, decisions about this infrastructure are not just a matter for private firms and investors, but also are, of course, an important public policy concern. As you can see in the figure here, there are large funding gaps that are unevenly distributed across infrastructure types. As net investment has declined, the average age of infrastructure continues to increase, requiring additional spending just to keep up with deterioration and to meet safety standards. For example, the average utility is predicted to have to spend 3.5 times as much on pipe replacement in 2030 as it did 30 years earlier. And the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that $3.6 trillion will be required just to bring infrastructure into a state of good repair, not counting any additional expansion. This is a federal, state, and local issue. State and local expenditures account for roughly 3/4 of total spending, though the federal share of investment is larger, especially in some areas like aviation. Importantly, a majority of public spending, 57%, is dedicated to operating and maintaining existing infrastructure. This leads us to the economic framework that we propose. The first question to ask, of course, is what projects to select. For a given project under consideration, fundamental questions here include, is there a need for the government to invest at all, or can it be effectively addressed by the private sector? Of course, while it sounds a little bit like a no-brainer, it's nonetheless worth regularly reminding policymakers to ask, do the benefits exceed the costs? As projects are considered, we use a fix-it-first approach where possible. Because infrastructure deficits have become large, as anyone who relies on the DC Metro can attest, deferred maintenance can be quite costly, and early and regular maintenance can be very cost-effective. Another important consideration, one that government is especially well-positioned to weigh, is non-pecuniary benefits that accrue to the quality of life. These benefits, such as health improvements, can be very difficult to quantify, yet can be very sizable. The next question is who should decide? Of course, some projects are better suited to local and state governments who may better understand local needs, while others have benefits that cross jurisdictional boundaries, suggesting a role for state and federal investment. In this process, it's important to think of infrastructure as an investment decision and thus try to insulate decisions from political pressure. Tools that help here may include a national infrastructure bank and certainly transparency and competitive bidding help. Third, we asked how to pay for the investments. The choice basically boils down to user fees or taxes. User fees, where possible and desirable, helps with selection of worthwhile projects and can manage congestion and avoid necessity of distortionary taxes. But sometimes user fees are infeasible or undesirable, especially when equity concerns are paramount. So debt finance is the conventional approach, and public-private partnerships offer additional options, which we will talk about in great detail on the panel. Panel will talk more about these public-private partnerships, which involve a firm taking on some or all of the design, construction, finance, operation, and maintenance responsibility of an infrastructure project. PPPs can make sense when it's important to give the contractor some skin in the game, but of course they're not a free lunch, and we want to remind people of that. Funding ultimately still comes from taxes or user fees. Finally, one way to approach infrastructure spending decisions is in terms of how they affect economic activity, both locally and nationally. As Bob said in his opening remarks, we think that this is complicated. And as we consider how large an infrastructure investment to make and how to allocate it and how to pay for it, the following factors must be considered, and many of these involve a certain amount of uncertainty. So these include how successful the successful projects are and what share of the projects are going to indeed be successful in the end of the day. For example, projects that are selected for political reasons rather than economic reasons might not have the same return. We also have to consider the rate of depreciation, the interest rate on borrowing, and the extent of crowd out, that is the share of spending that simply replaces previously planned infrastructure investments by state and local governments. And where applicable, the stimulus effects on the economy. So this economic framework for infrastructure spending, what to invest in, who should decide, and how to pay for it, should be rigorously debated as we turn in earnest to this policy discussion. Now I'd like to invite the panel up to discuss some of the weeds of how to do some fiscally responsible policy options for funding and financing infrastructure investments. Thanks.
So good morning, everyone. There we go, fixing the mic. I am Peter Orzag. I'm delighted to be with all of you this morning. We have a star-studded panel. Their bios are in this handy-dandy pamphlet that you already have, so we can skip that part. They're probably all well-known to all of you anyway. And we can jump right in. I would also note we were scheduled to end at 10. Steny Hoyer allowed us the wisdom of his thoughts, and we may go to 10:10 because we have a little bit of flexibility on the back end. I would highlight before we jump in 3 points that Diane underscored. The first is the importance of project selection. You may not hear much about this in the news, but the fact of the matter is, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the share of road surface in the U.S. that is good or better has actually been increasing, not declining, from about a third in the early 90s to about half today. Now, half is not great, but it's better than it was in the 90s. Similarly, bridge quality has actually been improving, despite everything that you hear about structural deficiencies in bridges. And I mention these things not to say that all is great in the state of the nation's infrastructure. It clearly is not, but rather to say we have to be careful about what projects are selected and which ones are not, because the general view that everything is terrible is not factually correct. Second point is it is easy to talk about the upfront financing. That's where a lot of the policy attention is. But operations and maintenance costs amount to about half of the total cost of infrastructure, and more than that in where some of the problem areas are air and transit. So you really need to think hard about how you're going to pay for the infrastructure over time and not just arranging the money up front. And then the final point is a big part of that involves user fees and revenue streams, which we have generally been reluctant to embrace in the United States relative to many other countries. And one of the questions we're going to be exploring is exactly how much traction we can get without, frankly, more users paying for the services that the infrastructure's providing. So with that, I'm going to basically just go down this august panel in order. Start with Alan Blinder here. Could you tell us about public-private partnerships? They're often seen as a panacea or a pixie dust elixir here to solve all the problems. Do they? When are they useful and when are they not?
They're certainly not the pixie dust solution. as Diane pointed out, you have project selection, you have financing, you have building. Frankly, as I look at it, if you think, where would you think the private sector's influence would be most positive? It would be in building, getting the thing done on time, efficiently, and so on. The place, and this is really the point that I want to make most strongly, where the private sector has the least advantage, in fact, a tremendous disadvantage, is in raising the money. So let me give you an analogy. A lot of you are familiar with industrial development bonds that many states issue for private purposes. That's a whole different story. We should take care of that in tax reform, but we won't. What's going on there is the private sector is performing beautiful arbitrage, borrowing at the cheap government rates in order to finance private sector capital. Think about the PPPs. It's exactly got the arbitrage in the opposite direction. The government, under a PPP, eschews the opportunity to borrow at cheap government rates. And I looked this up, actually, just the other day. Even in my state of New Jersey, nobody laughed, good, where Chris Christie has worked overtime to reduce our credit rating, the state of New Jersey borrows from infrastructure about 3.5%. That's about what the state of New Jersey pays. What does private equity, what would private equity need to finance a project like that? Many of the people in this room are aware that the Ross-Navarro plan, which we think is the Trump plan, but we don't really know, relies on private equity as the principal method of finance, subsidized by huge tax credits. Private equity investments, when you put in the 2% carry for the general partner, need about 12% or something. That's sort of standard now. It used to be higher in the good old days. Now it's about 12%. Think of the gap. So you got private equity investors leveraging their equity with 12% cost of capital, as opposed to states that can raise money at 3 or 4% capital. I could stop there, right? We could all do subtraction. The point is, even if you believe very strongly, and there probably is some truth to this, that private capitalists can drive the construction faster, cheaper, and better, even if you believe that, the gap between a 12% cost of capital and a 3 or 4% cost of capital is just going to overwhelm everything. So the attraction of PPPs, I've always thought, is largely exploiting the myopia of state governments. The typical state government, if you come to the governor or whoever's making decisions, say, well, you should probably float $2 billion of bonds and build whatever, or fill potholes, imagine that. They're going to say something like, well, we don't have the money, or something like that. The truth is, as Bob pointed out right at the beginning, the money is out there. There's a wall of capital available at very cheap rates for good credits. And even New Jersey is a good credit, and many of the states are better credits than New Jersey. So it seems to me it's a huge mistake to rely too much. There is a role of PPPs, but to rely too much on PPPs.
Alan, just one other question. One of the issues that arises in public-private partnerships is their long-term relationships between the private coalition and the sponsoring government. And things often go awry. So the Chicago parking meters, there are innumerable lists of projects that up front look like they would turn out one way, and then in reality, over 20 or 30 years, it goes adrift.
Right.
In those areas where this type of approach might make sense, any ideas on how to manage that the uncertainties that inevitably arise in these very long-term contracts, or is that just inevitable?
I think it's just inevitable. The first thing an economist thinks of, as you well know, is you have the private parties post a bond or something like that. But that's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen. We know what does happen is when there is a mess, the mess gets turned over to the state or local government. And you clean it up, because if you don't clean it up, you're going to have the voters on your back. When I wrote a Wall Street Journal column on this a couple of months ago, I looked up the track record of these, and I didn't know you were going to ask me that, so I don't remember. But it was if I remember correctly, it was something on the order of a third of the PPPs for roads that had gone bust, basically, if I'm remembering.
You said 29%, I remember, because I read it last night.
Thank you. At my age, to get 33 and 29,
It's not bad.
I'm counting that as a win.
Yeah.
That's really close.
Thank you.
So if public-private partnerships were the hot new idea in infrastructure a decade ago, and they still persist now, the new hot idea is using revenue from deemed repatriation to make infrastructure investments. And Roseanne, I guess, can you describe, there's this debate over what the deemed repatriation might look like. Is it on foreign profits, foreign cash? So how does this work? And then what is the link, if any, theoretically, politically, whatever, to infrastructure, or is this just a marriage of convenience?
Okay, well, I also want to say a little bit about repatriation tax holidays, if that's okay. So I can't figure out, and there's no obvious link between repatriation and infrastructure. They're completely separable, and it seems quite political to put them together. In fact, it's only something that I think could be conceived of in D.C. When I heard about it, I was in New York, and I thought I was missing something. So a transition tax on foreign profits held abroad by U.S. multinationals and a repatriation tax holiday that's also been discussed are two different things. So, I mean, it's not totally crazy, so I'll get there in a second. A transition tax, and this is what is the deemed repatriation tax, you could call it a toll charge or a deemed repatriation tax, involves a one-time increase in revenue, which could obviously be used for a one-time increase in infrastructure spending. It can't be used to provide permanent funding because it's a one-time increase. And it's part of a tax reform that would change how foreign profits are taxed going forward. A tax holiday loses revenue, so it couldn't be used to fund anything. It actually increases incentives for corporations to shift profits offshore in anticipation of future once-in-a-lifetime tax holidays. Because this would be, if we did a repatriation tax holiday, which I'm not sure how much is on the table, this would be the second one after promising that it would never happen again. So a little background. U.S. multinationals don't pay U.S. corporate tax on their foreign profits until the profits are brought home, until they're repatriated to the United States. Profits held abroad of U.S. multinationals were estimated to be $2.6 trillion in 2015 by the Joint Committee on Taxation, so one can only assume that they're bigger now because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. Firms have an incentive to just kind of keep stockpiling the money outside of the United States. Presumably, corporate tax reform would change how we treat, for tax purposes, future overseas profits. So that leaves the question of how are you going to treat existing profits, and that's where the transition tax comes in. It would be mandatory. Multinationals would have to pay taxes on existing foreign profits, whether they're repatriated or not. We would deem, that's where the deem comes in, all foreign profits to have been repatriated, whether or not they are, and they'd be subject to this transition tax, likely over a couple of years. And then future overseas profits would be taxed under the new rules agreed to as part of the tax reform. Obama proposed a 14% transition tax on existing offshore profits. And as part of transitioning to a new international tax system, and linked it to infrastructure investment. And that's where the deemed repatriation tax comes from, and it would be, I believe it would be on foreign cash held abroad, which, as we know, is in U.S. banks. So I'm hoping that's helpful. The repatriation holiday, on the other hand, is designed to get multinationals to return overseas profits to the United States by offering them a temporary, greatly reduced U.S. tax rate on their profits. The JCT estimated in 2014 that a 2-year holiday at a tax rate of 5.74% would lose $96 billion over 11 years. So it obviously couldn't be used to fund anything. It would encourage companies to shift more profits and investments abroad in anticipation of more tax holidays.
So thank you. Alan, you've also been Alan Auerbach, we need to be careful about the multiple Alans here. You've been very active in the tax debate, including on repatriation. Let's stick with deemed repatriation for a moment, because I think that's probably the more likely avenue here. What are your views on linking these two? Do you have insight into the form of the deemed repatriation that's likely to emerge from this political process? And more broadly, how do you see the role of the federal government and state governments in financing infrastructure?
Well, Peter, on the first question, the deemed repatriation, deemed meaning it, unlike in the case of the repatriation tax holiday, nothing need actually be done with the money. It's simply a tax on the offshore accumulated earnings of U.S. multinationals. The logic of a deemed repatriation, I think, as Roseanne said, very much is tied to the notion of corporate tax reform going forward, where the U.S. says we're abandoning the system of taxing income only when it comes home, and so we're not going to tax profits abroad based on repatriation on a going forward basis. We have to do something about that money that's been accumulated. And as we move to a new corporate tax system dealing with multinationals, put a tax on what's been accumulated, the logic being that companies probably anticipated paying some tax at some point in the future on unrepatriated earnings. And so since they won't have to under a new system, you're just collecting it in lieu of the taxes that otherwise would have been paid at some point in the future. And it makes very good sense to have such a charge imposed in the context of a broader corporate tax reform. It really makes very little sense to do that as part of some other overall budget measure. Now that said, of course, money's fungible, and you can say we're using the money from this pot to pay for this program. That doesn't really mean anything. It may mean something for entitlement programs like Social Security, where there is a legal connection between the taxes and the benefits. But in this case, it would really just be an impression as opposed to any kind of real connection. I think that a policy cost to making this connection in this case would be that it would probably make, given the way politics works, it would probably make the passage of international tax reform less likely because even in Washington, you can only use the money once. And money that's used for, or at least identified as being used for infrastructure, can't also be used to fund revenue losses that pop up elsewhere in a multinational tax reform package. And I think that's particularly unfortunate, given that this is one area of tax reform where, over the last several years, the two parties have identified as being at least a potential area of agreement because of the sense of how serious the problem of the current tax system is. On the second question about the source of funding, this I think really relates to the point Alan Blinder was making. One can distinguish between the sort of where the borrowing capacity is and who's on the hook for the liability. When we think about, in classic analysis in fiscal federalism in the field of public finance, we think about which level of government should be responsible for which types of expenditures. And one of the key issues that leads to federal government being responsible rather than state or local governments has to do with whether there are important spillovers across jurisdictions. So an argument for, say, a national highway system being provided at the federal level makes good sense because the benefits of connecting different areas accrue not to one state or another, but to both, and all those along the way. Many public infrastructure projects, regardless of how socially valuable they are projects where the benefits accrue largely to the residents of the local jurisdiction, whether that be a city or a county or a state. And because of that, the responsibility and the initiative for funding such projects really logically should rest at the level of the government where the benefits accrue. That is, it doesn't make any sense for the federal government to be making infrastructure decisions and funding infrastructure projects if most of the benefits accrue at the state level. Now, that doesn't mean that the greater ability of the federal government to borrow at low rates, perhaps, than state governments, can't be leveraged in a situation like this. That is, the federal government may be able to sort of transmit the funds, do the borrowing, transmit the funds to states in some way without necessarily being on the hook for repaying the debt and the interest and principal on the debt in the future. That is, one can imagine arrangements where federal government aids, either through tax policy or through direct borrowing, in making funds available to the states without having to cover the cost in the future. Because to the extent that states are acting in the interests of their citizens and have access to the capital market with or without the help of the federal government, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for the federal government to be not having to use its tax revenues to fund these projects, except to the extent that there are large benefits that accrue to those outside of the jurisdictions in which the spending occurs.
Alan, can you just also comment, there's been, it's been a favored approach of the Hamilton Project on the form of federal backing to prefer Build America bonds to the more traditional forms of support. And I guess modified to your point, you could have Build America bonds with the tax credit being drawn from state revenue rather than federal revenue. But do you have comments on the efficiency of Build America bonds relative to alternatives?
Well, the argument of Build America bonds is it's a tax benefit that accrues regardless of who the investor is in the bonds. And so in that sense, it makes more sense than the standard municipal tax-exempt municipal bond approach, where the benefits accruing to the state in terms of a lower cost of capital are inefficient, in the sense that part of the benefit of that tax exemption goes to some of the taxpayers who get more of a benefit than they would need to invest in the bonds. And that has been, it's an old argument, but it really didn't appear in policy until the Build America bond approach. And so I agree, that kind of approach to providing a subsidy or a lower borrowing rate for state and local borrowers is an efficient way of doing it.
Okay, great. So now let's, I'm going to bring in both Alan V. and Jason at the same time with basically the same question, which is interest rates remain relatively low. Arguably, the economy remains somewhat below potential, but we're kind of getting close. So how does, beyond the state of the nation's infrastructure and the kind of micro demand for infrastructure improvements, how does the state of the macroeconomy, both on interest rates and on where we are in the business cycle, change your views on whether a big infrastructure push today makes sense? Maybe we'll start with Jason and then go to Alan V.
Sure. And first, I want to sort of agree with most of what we've heard before and tell you that when I ran the Council of Economic Advisors, we had a very strict rule that a repatriation tax holiday was the single worst policy idea ever. And I once found out that our education person had gone to a meeting and said, this is the worst idea ever, and hadn't checked with me, and I was livid. I was like, maybe the second worst idea. Can't call it the worst idea. To your question, I think in terms of the macro right now, we are close enough to full employment, and infrastructure has enough of a lag that I don't think the Keynesian arguments are particularly important. I think a little bit of an extra emphasis on fiscal would take some of the pressure off monetary. It might deal with some of the financial imbalances, but I don't think I would do that through a sustained infrastructure program, and I certainly wouldn't do that at the expense of our medium and long run deficit. I think there's another argument, though, which is if you look at what's happened in this country, and I've done a lot of work on the question of labor force participation, and in particular prime-age men between 25 and 54, who've seen their labor force participation rates decline for decades. I think a lot of that has been rooted in demand and the reduction in manufacturing and the reduction in the demand for their labor. That's separate from an aggregate demand in insufficiency, but a particular demand for particular types of skill and labor. So I think there's a motivation there for putting a set of people to work that have had a harder time in our labor markets. Interest rates certainly fit into this, and just a lot easier to identify projects that pass the current hurdle rate than pass a hurdle rate a lot higher. When the Federal Highway Administration looked at this, they found about $83 billion of projects, and they do it in a very granular project-by-project way that pass a benefit cost analysis. That benefit cost analysis is grounded in what you think interest rates are. As a share of GDP, we're spending well below what we did in the late 1950s. We're spending below what we're spending most everywhere else in the OECD. So interest rates just strengthen that argument. But I think it's not just the quantity of what you're doing on infrastructure, it's how you're allocating the money. Only 20% of states use cost benefit. That we spend too little on maintenance and too much on building new projects. There's some things that are awkward. We spend too much in rural areas and not enough in urban areas, and money's misallocated by our political system in a big way in that dimension as well. And then last is the question of how we use our infrastructure. And it's borders on tragic that there was a consensus for 6 decades that users would pay for highways through the gas tax, and that was from 1956 to 2008. Since 2008, we've broken that link. We use general revenue to make up the difference. We've put over, I think, about $150 billion of general revenue in. It's now paying for about a quarter of the system, and that fraction is projected to rise, all because the gas tax hasn't been increased since 1993. It's fallen 40% in real terms, at the same time that we have more energy-efficient cars and people are driving less. So, trying to figure out how to solve these financing and allocation problems while also having users pay so that we're using our infrastructure better, I also think is particularly important. Has lost out some in the debate over, interest rates are so low, let's just have more. Let's also use it better, and how we pay for it can help us use it better.
Alan?
Yeah, so let me agree with much of, or nearly all of what's been said, and particularly I think Jason is right, that under today's economic conditions at least, we really should not be doing infrastructure investment for aggregate demand or Keynesian reasons. I think it would actually be best just to set that aside and instead look at what social needs is that infrastructure going to promote, how will it give us an infrastructure system that will really benefit people from the output and the use of that infrastructure, not the creation of jobs from building it. So one of the statements that has been made many times is that the low interest rates that we see today and that look like they will continue to some extent for the foreseeable future, that those low interest rates make the case for infrastructure investment stronger. I think that statement is right. I also think, though, that there is a potential to draw unwarranted inferences from extrapolating that statement. So just wanted to elaborate on that for a couple minutes. I think we need to emphasize that the right hurdle rate for a public investment is not the safe interest rate unless the investment is itself yielding safe benefits. And that's true even if the government is issuing safe debt in order to pay for or finance the infrastructure investment. Instead, what we want to do is to insist that any public sector investment yield roughly the same rate of social return as a similarly risky private sector investment. Now, let's emphasize that, as Diane mentioned earlier, the social return from a public investment, of course, includes non-pecuniary benefits, and those would have to be considered on an equal basis with pecuniary benefits in making those computations. So the question I think that arises is, when you see low interest rates today, should we assume that the hurdle rate for public sector investment has declined and that we can therefore do more of those investments? I think in general the answer is yes. There's actually a very good analysis of this that I found helpful, so I just give a plug for this, which is a paper by Doug Elmendorf and Louise Shaner. It's a Hutchins Center working paper that came out in October, Federal Budget Policy with an Aging Population and Persistently Low Interest Rates. My conclusions are not necessarily identical to theirs in every respect, but pretty similar, and their analytical framework I think is really, really useful, so I commend that paper to anyone who's interested. Let me just give then, in a minute or so, a quick overview of, I think, how we ought to approach this issue. You have to step back and ask, why are interest rates going to be low? And there's probably many factors contributing to it. One possibility is that there's just more savings in the world, so-called savings glut. And if that's the source of the low interest rates, then yes, definitely you should do more private sector and public sector investment. Those savings will do more private investment and drive down the return that it's providing, and then, of course, you want the public sector investment to be expanded until its return reaches that same level. Another possibility is that there are changes going on in the economy that just make private sector capital less productive. For example, there may be slowing labor force growth, there may be perhaps slower technological progress, and so in that case, what are the implications? Well, again, the private sector investment is less productive, and so assuming that the public sector investment isn't suffering from the same problems, then you would want to do more of it. We don't have to worry about sacrificing that private sector investment quite as much. Now, I think that may vary across different types of investment. Some types of investment really play into private production in almost the same way that private sector capital does. And so there, when private sector capital is becoming less productive, the public sector stuff may become less productive as well. And there wouldn't be any reason to increase public sector investment. For other types of investment, though, in the public sector, of course, it would be largely unrelated to what's going on in the private sector, and you probably would want to expand those types of investments. I think a similar analysis applies if you think that what's going on is that private investment is becoming more risky in its returns. Again, you would ask, is the public sector investment also becoming more risky in the same way? If so, you wouldn't have a reason to increase public sector investment. But if it wasn't happening for the public sector stuff, then you would want to expand it. A final possibility is just that Treasury securities are becoming more attractive to investors relative to other assets for liquidity reasons or regulatory reasons. And so in that case, I mean, in econo world, what you'd want to do actually is if one asset's more attractive than another, the government should issue the Treasury securities and then buy the other assets that are less favorable. I think that in the real world, we don't really see the government doing a lot of asset purchases, so the government might want to increase its deficit some if it can issue these assets on better terms, and it may want to then expand all of its spending and offer tax cuts as well. Certainly, to tie back to a point that Alan Blinder made, if an investment is worth doing, then you might want to try, if at all possible, to finance it using the cheaper form of finance as opposed to financing it some other way. In summary, then, I think the low interest rates do provide a case for expanding public sector investment, depending on exactly what the type of investment is and where the low interest rates are coming from. But we should still insist that public sector investments meet a relatively stringent cost-benefit test of offering the same social returns as private sector investments that are equally risky.
Great. Let me bring in Alan Blinder on the macroeconomic environment and infrastructure. But before we do, I also want to just let people know there are people circulating with note cards that you can ask questions on, and we'll try to incorporate your questions into the discussion also. So if you have one, please look for those folks who are circulating. They'll come collect the cards also. Alan.
Thank you, Peter. I want to agree very strongly with the notion that you've heard that the Keynesian case, stimulate the economy because there's unemployment, for infrastructure spending, was very powerful when Peter was running the Budget Bureau, and has gotten weaker over time, and by now has pretty much disappeared. We're either at full employment or within spitting distance of full employment. So the notion that this is the way to grow the GDP, which I and many people were saying repeatedly in 2008, 2009, and 2010, has just been swept away by history. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do infrastructure spending for all the reasons that Alan Viard and others were just saying. The point I want to make, which hasn't been mentioned up to now, is that when you think about financing infrastructure by deficit spending, whether it be at the federal level or at state and local levels, the standard argument against running larger deficits is they push up real interest rates and they crowd out private investment. And so you're kind of biting your nose to spite your face. If this is at full employment, this is the non-Keynesian or even the anti-Keynesian argument. I just want to make an obvious point. If the government does that, finances spending by running a deficit, but the spending is on investment, then it's pretty much tautological that you don't have crowding out. You may have some less private investment and more public investment, and that's where the project selection becomes crucial, We don't want to build bridges to nowhere. We want to build infrastructure projects that have good rate of return, but there is no worry about crowding out to the extent the money is going for public investment.
So one other question I wanted to ask all of you before taking the questions from the audience has to do with the new environment, risk of protectionism. We have historically had Buy America type of constraints on infrastructure. Do any of you see that getting worse, better? How does that play into the debate over whether we should be doing more infrastructure? And then relatedly, arguably, international trade has been driven more by the invention of container shipping and the infrastructure and other innovation that has surrounded that than all of the trade agreements that have been agreed to over the past several decades. So both on domestic content laws and also on the ability for new infrastructure perhaps to promote more trade in a kind of less contentious way than trade agreements, what in the next few years look like, if anyone has a strong perspective on that, or not?
Well, I'll start with the first. It will be a total shock if the answer to the protectionism part of your question isn't worse. Everything else is pointing in that direction, and these kinds of things make a very ripe target. It's kind of naturally domestic, and it's very easy to make a case, especially if you're a demagogue, that it's a bad thing to buy the steel from China or whatever else it is. So I'll be shocked if that doesn't get much worse.
And there were a few Buy America provisions even in the 2009 stimulus, and so when you consider the fact that Barack Obama was president then and that Donald Trump is president now, and we consider the extent to which each of them is likely to have protectionist goals, I think we can infer that there is a strong danger of those provisions appearing in a more extensive form. And obviously that would be unfortunate. And in principle, it could change, I guess, the decision of how much of the investment you want to do. I mean, you could imagine on the margin a public project that would just barely be worth doing if it was really done in the lowest cost manner. And then because of some Buy America provision or Davis-Bacon provision, it becomes somewhat more costly. And so then perhaps that borderline project would actually become not worth doing. Naturally, if a project is really serving vital needs, you would still want to go ahead with it, even if you unfortunately were saddled with some of these costly restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, just on your second point, I think it's just a sort of amusing irony that somebody might object to lowering tariffs but be completely fine investing in a port when the investment in a port makes it cheaper to bring stuff in here, cheaper to send stuff abroad, and is functionally equivalent to tariff reduction. So the framing of these things, matter a lot, and fully rational policymakers aren't even immune to that framing.
I just wanted to emphasize a point I think that was implicit in what Alan Viard said, which is that the projects that would be potentially most affected by these kinds of restrictions would become, therefore, the ones most likely to be not worth undertaking. That is, because the costs would go up more as a result of the restrictions, and this might be true of more of some projects than others. And yet, in the political environment in which these restrictions arise, those would also become the projects that would be most politically attractive to undertake. And therefore, we sort of lose both ways. Projects become more expensive in general, and project choice is skewed toward the ones that become suffer the most from this increase in costs. And I think that is something that we need to take account of in controlling our excitement over the prospects for increases in infrastructure investment in this environment.
Well, we've gotten lots of great questions, so let me start bringing in some of the questions from the audience. The first one has to do with emerging technologies. So, Jason, you had mentioned the gas tax. There is evidence that when people pay using an easy pass as opposed to paying a coin into a toll collector, the the acceptability is different. Do emerging technologies on basically collecting user fees change the dynamic in any important way? And B, as the world evolves, are we going to tax driverless cars the same way we tax existing cars, electric vehicles the same way we tax gas-powered cars, et cetera? So what will transportation 2020 or 2025 look like along this dimension?
Yeah, no, I imagine the gas tax is just a shorthand, but there's a lot of ways one should think about, and vehicle miles traveled. The gas tax gets at one externality, which is that you're producing carbon. It doesn't get at the wear and tear on the roads in a particularly effective way, using things, and it doesn't get at congestion in a particularly effective way, because the gas tax is the same at night as it is during the day, and in a crowded place the same as in an uncrowded place. We've had economic theories since Vickery, half century ago, that told us how to deal with all of it. We have the technologies to do that now. There's a set of privacy concerns around that which have a certain amount of merit and one would want to address. And then there's a set of I don't want to pay concerns around it, which have considerably less merit because we're all paying for all of this anyway. This is just a different way to pay it. And there's creative ideas that the Hamilton Project has done years ago, for example, like pay-as-you-drive car insurance, that you pay basically the same car insurance whether you drive a little or a lot. You link this to your car insurance, and for a lot of people, their car insurance would end up being cheaper unless you drive a lot, in which case it would be commensurately more costly. So I think this opens up really important avenues, and just you don't even need devices in your car, just reading your license plates. And by the way, if you think you have lots of privacy, anyone can see the license plate on your car and sort of watch you as you drive around anyway, not to make anyone nervous.
Well, I have to say, it's interesting the wisdom of the crowd here. Your questions are way better than mine, although there was at least one that I asked that someone else had, so that's encouraging.
Were they not paying attention?
Yeah.
There was a lag between when it was written and our proceedings, I'm sure. Question about climate change, resilience, how one should think about where we are making investments given the potential changes that might happen, and what can we do with our existing infrastructure to make it potentially more resilient given the risks associated with climate? Anyone have a...
Let me just go
Sure.
very briefly on that. This is one place where there actually is a magic bullet, and it's called the carbon tax. If you put in a sensible carbon tax, everything will, it's a slight exaggeration to say everything will come out right. That's not exactly right, but you can get most of it. That includes gas-guzzling cars, who drives more, whether you drive in a congested period where the pollution is more costly and also you're paying more because you're getting less mileage on your car, whether to generate electricity by burning fossil fuels or by windmills or solar or anything. All of that is largely taken care of by something that almost no American politician is willing to swallow, which is a carbon tax.
So our next question is on...
You see, none of us are running for office.
Exactly. Our next question is on some of the details of the tax. So maybe I'll ask Roseanne to comment on this. The question basically is, do you anticipate transition rules for even, over what period of time would the tax have to be paid? The House bill has a different tax rate on foreign profits held in cash versus foreign profits not held in cash. How do you see some of these details playing out?
I'm not sure are the foreign profits held as cash versus non-cash, but I see the details on the transition tax playing out as it would be a mandatory tax, of course, and I see it as being paid over a certain number of years, allowing the multinationals to pay it over a certain number of years. And of course, the big question is going to be what's the rate? And that's going to be an important debate.
Do you have a guess?
I guess my guess is that it would be relatively low. So Lower than
Single digits?
Less than 14%.
Less than 14%.
I mean, if you're paying a temporary revenue in exchange for permanent tax cuts, you should actually want a higher rate, because the higher the rate is, the more those permanent tax cuts are, the larger the increase in the deficit. So I don't want a higher rate for that reason. But if you're a company sitting there trying to negotiate, this is a particularly good deal for you.
And-
Peter, as you know, there is a certain logic in the way these things are put together, that it would be payable over 10 years. Because there's no point in stretching it out any longer. You don't get any credit for that. So
And I do think it would be on cash, but I don't know. I guess the House bill has both.
Yeah, and actually the administration's was on profits, not cash, and
Yeah.
that's one of the things that companies are starting to pay attention to.
The details will start really mattering soon.
So one thing we didn't really touch on, and it would be interesting to get pretty much everyone's perspective on this, is a question involving a national infrastructure bank, which is often held out as a kind of elixir, again, on the financing front. But I think the Hamilton Project has correctly said where its value would really lie is in project selection. So are we uniformly for infrastructure bank, against? Where do people come out? Why don't we start with Alan and quickly go down the
Well, I think you'd have to specify how it would work. I mean, again, the crucial thing is to end up choosing the projects that are most beneficial, and again, financing them in the cheapest way, which, as Alan Blinder said, would normally be through the Treasury borrowing.
So I learned everything about this topic from Aaron Klein, standing there in the back, who did Senator Dodd's proposal and worked heavily on our proposal in the administration. I think a small infrastructure bank has a small role in the overall infrastructure system. If you look at the proposal we made in the Obama administration, we had about $10 billion of capital, so that would be the total maximum amount of cost to taxpayers from it. It could focus on multimodal, multi-regional projects that might otherwise fall through the cracks. For it to work, it'd be critical that it was staffed in a really technocratic, expertise, cost-benefit driven way. But even with all of that, there just is only a limited number of projects that meet this criteria. So to do it at a much larger scale or think it's going to replace everything else you're going to do, I think is mistaken. I think that's the critical difference between a proposal like that and a proposal like the Navarro-Ross one from the campaign, is both the scale, $10 billion versus something much, much larger, and the selection, having a technocratic body, picking a few large things that make sense versus something that I don't even know if it's generally available or allocable on a much larger scale. So I think it has a role, but a limited and
But Jason,
carefully done role.
so I'm going to lead in with another question, which is, you've all spoken about better project selection. So if it's an infrastructure bank has some role, but it doesn't solve it, how do we get to better project selection? What specifically do we do that makes
One
this
simple
better?
idea, we give out money to states in formula grants. Make that money conditional on or have a bonus for states that set up a cost-benefit office and allocate their money based on cost-benefit. So we can leverage our federal dollars to bring about changes in state policies. That would be one example of how to do that.
Alan, do you have strong views on an infrastructure bank?
No, I don't. To echo the previous two speakers, I think the biggest value that the federal government can provide here, particularly where there are not large spillovers among states, is in not only providing expertise where that expertise might not be available, but also in helping state and local governments withstand the political pressure that they will feel to make bad project choices even when they have good information.
Zen, I know you're more focused on taxes, but
No, I agree with what's been said before.
okay, great, thank you.
To me, the whole thing comes down to how removed from politics you can make this infrastructure bank, whether it be a national infrastructure bank or even a state infrastructure bank. And I include in that something that is often forgotten, which is what's going to count as infrastructure. That's a plastic, soft plastic. That's a rubber band sort of a borderline, and political exigencies of various sorts can stretch it in directions that maybe a bunch of technocrats wouldn't think are appropriate. So, I think it's probably better than what we have now, but it's pretty far from a panacea, I think.
On the definition of infrastructure, there's one risk is that it's defined too broadly. The other is that it's defined too narrowly in the sense that there may be a tendency to emphasize construction relative to maintenance. And Diane mentioned this, and it's a long-standing pattern that we've seen again, that the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new project is more politically appealing to political decision makers than is the, correcting a deferred maintenance situation. And so that's another thing that I think, the federal government should probably try to leverage its financing power on to influence states to make sure that maintenance isn't shortchanged.
This is a question on the tax credit idea. Maybe I'll ask our resident tax experts, Alan and Roseanne, if they have perspectives. Is there anything, including from other parts of the tax code, where we can minimize this problem of a tax credit buying out the base of projects that would have happened anyway? Or is that just an inevitable part of having a tax credit for anything?
Yeah, the incremental tax credit is an idea that comes up often, and we've had proposals for incremental investment tax credits. We have other incremental credits. As Roseanne knows from having worked on this in her dissertation, the R&E credit, when it was first introduced and over the years, has been an incremental credit. And depending on how you make it incremental, you can actually blunt the incentive to invest quite substantially or lead to other kinds of perverse outcomes. There is a trade-off, clearly, in the sense that you're giving revenue for projects that would have occurred anyway. But I think in practice, the complexity makes it the case that you can't save that much money by making credits incremental.
Yes, I mean, in theory, it's exactly what you would want to do if you could define incremental. But then when you start putting in place something that you think is going to hit incremental, you end up you can end up easily creating perverse incentives and make things incredibly complicated and not at all transparent. And I agree that there's this cost that you're just going to have to bear. It would be so wonderful if we could design the perfect incremental credit. And here I don't see technology helping us out at all.
The history of the research tax credit really confirms that, I think, that it was designed from the beginning. It's been advertised as an incremental credit, and while that may be somewhat feasible for a short-term provision, it becomes more and more difficult as you go through time and original base periods become less relevant. The epicycles that have been added to the research credit over the years, I think, really make for an interesting story in themselves and suggest at some point, that maybe this was a well-intentioned but misdirected endeavor to try to make it incremental.
Right. I mean, with a lot of these things, both the tax credits and the infrastructure, people love to make these great claims about leverage. We're only putting this number of federal dollars in, it's going to leverage up this, and at the end of the day, your $1 billion is going to turn into $100 billion of new investment. I think anytime you hear that type of claim, think the higher the ratio of the thing that's happening to the thing you're putting in, the more likely it is that it would have happened anyway. And the more likely that you've just subsidized and provided a windfall for existing investment rather than created something new. I mean, in some sense, we could give like a 1/1,000,000th of 1% investment tax credit and then go out and take credit for the $2 trillion of investment in our economy every year and have just extraordinary leverage ratios for that particular policy. But some of it has exactly that feature and is equally laughable.
It is. I had one very short thought to that. There's history here. As soon as the idea of making it incremental leaves the realm of the economists and goes to the politicians, it's dead.
Like many things. The next question is about federalism, and in particular, the role of land use policies, which are typically state or especially local. And maybe I'll direct this to Jason, given that the CEA, under your leadership, did a lot of work in this area. What's the federal role in driving land use reform at the state and local level? The question mentions density bonuses near transportation hubs as an example.
Yeah, so I think this is a really big issue, that the places in our country that are the most productive and the most desirable to live, are the most expensive, in part, for those reasons. And, San Francisco has a certain geography that makes it harder to build more. But San Francisco also has a set of rules that make it harder to build more, drive up rents, provide a reward for incumbent landholders, and ultimately, I think, increase inequality and reduce productivity. The bulk of dealing with a question like that is appropriately a local one, but I think there's nothing wrong with the federal government using its bully pulpit. In the Obama administration, we didn't just do that, but put out a template and a guide for what states and localities who wanted to could do about these problems and try to bring awareness and attention, and got a number of mayors and others interested. I think to a secondary degree, there are a set of federal policies that have a nexus to this. We do a lot of subsidizing of housing and building and transportation. And when we allocate those dollars, we could make some of them, again, conditional on what you're doing in land use, or give a bonus for places that are doing better there, as well as just use them in a way that helps more building and more density. And I think that would have a broader set of benefits, and goes against ultimately what is sort of quite literally in this case rent seeking. And I think we have a role to play in trying to countervail that power.
So we have two questions about infrastructure spending in the power/electricity sector. The first is, why has it and rail fared better than other types? And the second is, what actually is the argument for public support of infrastructure in the power sector beyond climate externalities? Anyone want to tackle the sectoral allocation of our infrastructure spending? No.
Oh, I just spoke, so I was trying to avoid going again.
Go ahead.
I think things that, I'm quoting Peter from television this morning, freight rail is something that we put very little federal dollars into. It has a private return, and it does pretty well. Passenger rail, not so much. And, ports in the United States are among the best in the world, and they have a private return, and they're largely privately financed. Our highways fall below the quality in the rest of the world. So to some degree, you want to look at whether there's a private return in a sector. When it comes to energy, there was a real desire to build out a smart grid. There still is. It's an important thing. We spent a lot of time, Peter and I and others, looking at this question. It turned out there wasn't actually a whole lot for the federal government to do. Some of the main obstacles to it were NIMBY, local permitting types of issues. Maybe there was something we could do to help drive that forward, but these things had a really high return to the private investors. So, insofar as there's a federal role and contribution, it wasn't really in the dollars. It was on, the policy and permitting side.
The last question is about anything at all that we can learn from foreign economies and how they either finance or fund infrastructure. What are other countries doing that we could mimic that would help along our infrastructure challenge?
Well, the first thing I think of is congestion fees, which are not ubiquitous anywhere, but quite a few countries, including the UK and Singapore and a variety of others, are way ahead of us. I've something I wrote. I drew the contrast between London's congestion charge and Manhattan. Manhattan's so much easier. You can't get in there without a tunnel or a bridge. London, there's God knows how many ways to get in to London. So this would be a piece of cake with modern technology to have a congestion fee.
Especially around Trump Tower?
I would make it really high around Trump Tower, but that's me.
And he's saying this as somebody that lives in New Jersey. I mean, this is a big deal for you.
Any other
Well, I'll just
lessons
say
from Ron?
two things about that. First of all, Alan, you may remember that when Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he proposed such a congestion fee. It was not one of his more popular
It didn't
proposals.
get very far. No, Americans don't like it. Huh?
The second thing is, I'm not, while there may be a role, I think I certainly agree there is a role for such fees, except in terms of sort of getting local governments to do the right thing. It's not exactly clear why this is a federal issue.
Oh, yeah,
Congestion is very much a local externality, and unless there's a sort of a political malfunction that makes it easier for the federal government to get the right things done, I think this is largely left to the local governments.
Any other lessons from abroad we want to highlight before closing? Anyone else? Okay. Well, let me just say I'd like to thank Steny Hoyer, Bob Rubin, Diane, and the rest of the Hamilton Project folks, along with our stellar cast up here on the stage. Thank you all for joining us, and let's hope that the highways, railroads, and airports in 2025 are significantly better than today. Thank you very much.